And so we can switch on the top.
Okay. Welcome everyone to the first keynote of the conference. The keynote is titled Ecological and Environmental Justice in Heterodox Economics, and we have three very distinguished speakers. We're going to follow the order as specified in the program. So the first one to talk will be Bengi, Akbulut, who is an associate professor at the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at Concordia University. Her research is in political economy, ecological and feminist economics. Her joint and independent work appeared in Cambridge Journal of Economics, Development and Change, Journal of Peasant Studies, Ecological Economics, and Geoforum, among others. She has also co-edited the book titled Neoliberal Turkey and Its Discontents, Economic Policy and Environment in the Justice and Development Party, ERD, with Fikret Adaman and Murat Arsel. Her recent work focuses on economic alternatives, including degrowth, economic democracy, and democratic economic planning. Her current research, funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, investigates democratic forms of economic decision from an ecological perspective. She is part of the editorial collective of Studies in Political Economy and Rethinking Marxism. She co-directs Concordia University's Social Justice Center since 2021, and she's going to give a talk on ecological justice, a heterodox economics toolbox. But let me introduce the other two speakers as well, so then I'll just get out of the way and keep my mouth shut for the next, hour or so. Damaris Coffman is going to go second, and she's Professor of Economics and Finance of the Built Environment at the Bartlett at University College London, where she's also vice dean innovation and enterprise. She works at the intersection of economic history, economic geography, environmental economics, and the history of economic thought. She's an editor-in-chief and coordinating editor of Structural Change in Economic Dynamics, and serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Cleaner Production, Economia Politica, and Frontiers in Engineering Management. In recognition of her contributions to the interdisciplinary social sciences, she has been elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and a foreign member of the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei in Italy. She's also a distinguished visiting professor at Tsinghua University's Department of Earth Systems Science. Her talk is going to be on a reappraisal of Albert Einstein's theory of structural transformation in an era of decarbonization. And last but very much not least, Maria Nikolaidi, who is an associate professor in economics at the University of Greenwich. She's also a fellow at the Forum of Macroeconomics and Microeconomic Policies, also known as FMM. Her research areas include microfinancial policies, ecological macroeconomics, and financial fragility. Her work has been published on a wide range of peer-reviewed journals, including the Cambridge Journal of Economics, Ecological Economics, the Journal of Financial Stability, Journal of Economic Surveys, and Structural Change and Economic Dynamics. She has worked on research projects on ecological macroeconomic modeling, the greening of monetary policy, and the links between income distribution and growth. She's a member of the committee of the Post-Keynesian Economic Society, a trustee of the Foundation for European Economic Development, and an advisory panel member of Positive Money. She's also an associate editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics and a member of the editorial boards of the Review of Political Economy, the JPKE, Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, and the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policies. The title of her talk is Green Macrofinancial Policies and Environmental Justice. And I exhausted the time allotted to me, and the time allotted to them is 20 minutes. So The floor is yours, Bengi.
Do you want the questions?
The questions are going to be asked at the very end after the 3 talks. Do you want me to give you the time?
Well, maybe, yes, maybe the 5-minute mark. I'm not sure if that mic is picking me up. Yep, okay, perfect. Thank you for, thank you to the organizers, first of all, for having me here. Thank you all for for making it meaningful that I'm here. And thank you for the very generous introduction. But also I want to kind of start by recognizing that association of a heterodox economics is special in my heart, because I've actually done my very first academic presentation in another Association for Heterodox Economics conference 16 years ago in Cambridge. So it's good to be back in a different role, I guess. So what I'm going to talk about, this mic is for, all right.
Hang on, Jeff. Leave it on the table. Don't attach because then it gives echo on the Zoom. Put it on the table.
Put it, okay.
Yeah.
So I'll put it on the table and you want me to sit on?
No, you can stand
This
up.
is good, all right.
This is fine.
That's good, all right. So as you see, the title of my talk today is kind of Ecological Justice, a Heterodox Economics Toolbox. So I'm gonna start kind of drawing on, I'm gonna be drawing on different strands in heterodox economics to first kind of elaborate why the certain ways that we think about social reality are important for talking about ecological justice and how they kind of, how we act upon and how they justify certain ways of acting upon questions that we face. And then I'm gonna kind of more concretely talk about, kind of move into what does it mean for economists and what does it mean for organizing our economic relations to kind of bring, if you will, ecological justice. And I'm going to use a few entry points to kind of get us into thinking about that. First will be, what is the economy? That will be a very basic question. The second will be about individual behavior. So what do individuals do? And the third one will be about kind of more broadly, what do institutions do? I'm just kind of giving you a heads up about the talk. But kind of that's going to be the outline. So what is the economy? It seems quite kind of basic, but it's also a very, very big question, right? And obviously there are many different ways that heterodox economists have pushed the boundaries of questions, kind of definitions of the economy. And I'm going to be drawing on 2 particular schools in particular. The first will be ecological economics and the second will be feminist economics. So this is pretty much what we face when we take an economics course. And I'm not only talking about mainstream economics courses, right? A lot of my students kind of think about this, the circular flow, when they think about the economy, and a lot of us kind of reproduce this representation. But what the question of ecological justice requires us to do today is to think critically about what this picture leaves outside. So instead, ecological economists start with something like this. So where there is a closed biophysical system within which there is the society, the social system is embedded, within which the economic system is embedded, and within which we see the circular flow, right? And all of these kind of nested systems interact with each other in a way that is not necessarily known or predictable all the time. So what ecological economists say, or what ecological economics say the economy is that it is a part of the biophysical system. It's an open system, it is embedded in the closed global system. So it's not that there's the environment and there's the economy, and the environment is where externalities happen, rather that they're embedded systems. What this says is that what we call the economy is also biophysical. It is governed by biophysical laws because the economy is also comprised of biophysical flows of materials and energy. Every economic activity, therefore, has an externality. So the externality question is not only because prices or markets are lacking, but every economic activity has a biophysical implication. And then instead of kind of predictable or static relationships between the systems, actually the world in which we live in the economic world, is governed by dynamic interactions and interrelations between these kind of nested systems and the whole network of physical and social systems, the idea of co-evolution. What this says, what this view of the economy, this definition and representation of the economy says to us is that the question of scale, and I'm not talking about geographical scale, but I'm talking about biophysical scale, that is the quantity of materials and energy an economic system uses, metabolizes, and then discards as waste, is not reducible to a question of allocation or distribution. We need to be addressing it separately. This is one key kind of foundational idea of ecological economics. The other one that is very important, and it's going to I'm going to carry this idea throughout my talk, is that because the economy or economic relations are also biophysical, they're also governed or characterized by uncertainty and ignorance, complexity, novelty, and irreversibility, which is kind of fundamental characteristics of biophysical processes, which means that there are things that we don't know, but we can assign a probability to, which is uncertainty. And then there are things that we don't even know. Not only that we cannot assign a probability, we don't know radically, we cannot even imagine as outcomes of future, which is ignorance. And then there's open ignorance, which means that we don't even know, we don't know. And that's the more fundamental characteristic that marks our relationship with the global biophysical system today. The other part is complexity, novelty, and irreversibility, which means that by looking at past states of the world, we cannot adequately predict what's going to happen because biophysical processes are complex. There are many novelties, which means we cannot really know how the system will react to them. And irreversibilities, which means that after a threshold, we cannot really reconstruct past states. This is the condition we're in because we're living in a biophysical reality, but also because it's a lot more pressing with kind of biophysical limits being approached so much. This also means that we need to be rethinking of the objective of the economy radically for ecological justice. So we need to be kind of rethinking concepts of efficiency, growth, utility, profit maximization, all these good economic outcomes. We need to be thinking about resilience. We need to be thinking about sustainable scale. We need to be thinking about sufficiency. So we need to be thinking as heterodox economists about what a good economic outcome is. But also we need to be thinking about what economics is as a science, as a knowledge production, because we need to actually face the fact that there are certain things we can never know about the future. We need to be thinking about the role of economics as science and its claims to scientificity. But the second kind of school of thought that I mentioned is feminist economics, as I said. And they also have been defined or pushing the limits of the definition of what the economy is in different ways for a very long time. So not only kind of the definition and definition of what the economy is. So kind of the definition of the economy being restricted to market interaction, commodity production, rational choice under conditions of scarcity has been criticized by feminist economists for a very long time, because it neglects of domains that are often coded as humans. So work that is done for ecological and social reproduction, if you look. There are different ways of work that often remains unpaid, that is often non-market, and that is often coded unproductive and then kind of left outside of the definition of the economy. But also feminist economists have very notably criticized the indicators or representations of this definition of what constitutes the economy, GDP and monetary indicators, most notably. And they instead bring to fore broader definitions of what the economy is, what constitutes production, what is work or what is labor. And they have very famous, I mean, there are famous kind of or notable, if you will, theorizations of the economy as more a dual sphere or nested spheres of kind of non-monetized and monetized activity. Feminist economists have also came up with notions to capture kind of this invisible economy, if you will, such as the work of reproductivity or meta-industrial labor. The last point I want to make about this is that what is defined as economy and what is left outside is not an unfortunate accident or a kind of a very innocent oversight. So there are also kind of strands of heterodox economists who actually theorize this as a part of capitalism, that actually this definition or this coding of nature's work and women's work as the non-economy is necessary, it's been a necessary condition for the global development of capitalism. And this is an important question unless we can we address what is left outside of the discussions of the economy, there's no way we can actually meaningfully address the question of ecological justice. Because it's kind of this definition, this separation of the economy from non-economy itself is a question of injustice. And then it's also helpful to think about ecological justice as beyond kind of a distribution of costs or environmental goods and bads, but also kind of arguably more pressing questions of whose work and whose production that is invisible today that we will be drawing on, that we will have to exploit in order for transitioning out of this economy. And we can come back to this if you will, if you want after. The second entry point for me, as I said, is what do individuals do? And I'm sure many of you are familiar here that they kind of this concept of homo economicus have been criticized by by heterodox economists of different schools because of this idea of an isolated individual getting into voluntary transactions based on mutual consent has been criticized again by feminist economists notably, but also old institutionalist economists who have not only kind of highlighted that this is not a realistic kind of representation of what individuals do, but also kind of pushed kind of the boundaries of this conceptualization to say that there are broader kind of motivations and values people act upon when they're making decisions or when they're acting as economic agents. But what I want to again kind of more importantly highlight today is that this idea that human preferences, if you will, or individual behavior is not static and there's no kind of human essence, as again, I'm sure you're very familiar with the question, with the argument here, but that this is important for questions of ecological justice because institutions and environmental values co-evolve. Again, this is coming from ecological economics, but also institutional economics, that institutions that we choose, institutional structures that we put in place in order to govern our relationship with nature. And it includes kind of market mechanisms. It includes price-based policy mechanisms, for instance. They do not only mutually relay information or kind of reveal values that people have, but they actually articulate value. So this notion of value articulating institutions comes from institutionalists, but that institutions change the very logic by which we make decisions, which means if we put people into thinking, into institutional structures where environmental costs are made compatible with monetary payments, and we ask them how much they're willing to pay, if we actually put in a tax that for carbon, that makes, again, shape the perception of the ecological problem in question. We're also kind of shaping people to perceive the environmental question as if we can pay our way out of it. And I'll talk about why it's not possible to pay our way out of it in a minute. But this means that there is no kind of one way in which we act upon environmental questions as individuals. And rather than taking individual values or preferences as given, we should be thinking about what kind of institutions should be forming. Our policy choices might be optimal in one sense, but again, maybe they're making ecological justice compatible with monetary measures, and that's not the way we want to go for ecological justice. We should be rather thinking about how we can foster other logics than the individual calculation of costs and benefits when it comes particularly to the question of ecological justice, and how we can build institutions for it. Talking about institutions, that's kind of my last entry point. So apart from shaping individual values, apart from giving us cues about how to approach a question, changing, framing our perception of the question or the problem at hand, again, old institutional economics is a long tradition of kind of starting with William Cupp, but definitely not limited to him, of thinking about how capitalist institutions, and I'm using institutions in a very kind of broad and liberal way, admittedly, or institution structures of capitalism, such as the markets and the private firm, actually encourage both kind of ecologically damaging growth and profit maximization, or accumulation, if you will, but also kind of cost shifting, what kind of mainstream economics calls externalities. That this is not externalities, again, kind of from this perspective, it's not an unfortunate accident or a lack of markets or prices, but rather a pervasive and systemic outcome of markets under capitalism. So kind of institutions do this too. So institutions shape, articulate values. Institutions of capitalism in particular are kind of growth perpetuating and kind of cost shift and perpetuating cost shifting into the broader society and nature. But what I will argue, again, drawing on heterodox economics, is that it's not only that they are this way under capitalism, but because of the very nature of economic governance that markets and firms kind of articulate, they're very ill-equipped to deal with questions of ecological justice. And here I'm talking about markets as a decentralized mechanism of allocation of inputs in particular, but also coordinating production and consumption decisions, and firms as private governance of production decisions, what to do, how much and how to produce, what to produce, and what to do with surplus or where to invest it. And I'm going to highlight two particular kind of themes here. First, these institutions are kind of forms of economic governance where decisions are made primarily based on prices. And again, kind of prices are not good indicators, or should not be taken as good indicators of decisions, especially given the interdependence of social, economic, and ecological systems, for two reasons. First, one thing that I highlighted earlier in my talk, that future is unknown. The future is radically unknown. So the prices can at best reflect incomplete information about what is at stake, right? About underlying intertemporal biophysical implications. And this goes for pricing natural resources as well, right? This goes also for ecologically correcting prices as well. We should face this fact. We should accept this fact that there is a huge unknowable future whose costs can be catastrophic. The second one is this idea of value or economic incommensurability that actually comes from Otto Neurath during the socialist calculation debate. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, but has been taken up by ecological economists such as John O'Neill and Joan Martinez-Aliar, that because that every value that inform environmental valuations, or every value that we attach to the environment, can never be reduced to one unit, such as prices, such as monetary valuations. Again, prices can at best capture a subset of values that is attached to an environmental good or a bad. So prices should not be guiding, or prices should not be the only thing that guides our economic decisions, but institutions of capitalism are based on price-making decision making. The second one is that these institutions perpetuate independent, atomistic decision-making in an interdependent world. We live in an interdependent world, which means what I choose to do, and this is all the more important today, if I choose to buy a car, that will have an impact on all of you. What I choose to produce has an impact on all of you. There is no independent kind of production or consumption decision anymore. And so we need to have institutions that reveal these social and physical interdependencies, that reveal and kind of collectively and democratically govern these interdependencies. Which brings me to governing economic decisions needs to be economic and just for ecological justice and for sustainability, not only because they are good things in themselves, that being democratic and just economic institutions, they're actually a requisite for sustainability and therefore ecological justice. A deliberative and democratic decision-making can reveal interdependencies, can incorporate the values of all those who are affected by possible outcomes. It gives us a better way, more just way to deal with ignorance and uncertainty that kind of affects future. And it also kind of is a democratic reasoned dialogue. Institutions of reasoned dialogue opens the space for, if you will, political re-education of values. Kind of keep that in mind, that institutions are value articulating, not only revealing. And secondly, that we should be building on multi-criteria decision-making. So not only price-based decisions, or not only prices should be guiding our economic decisions, but non-monetary criteria that does not reduce the social ecological impacts of our economic decisions to prices. So what does this say for ecological justice? A few kind of 3 points. First, we need to be thinking about ecological justice beyond the matter of distribution. It's a lot more and much less a question of distribution that can be compensated or counteracted by monetary measures, right? Because all the reasons that all the kind of wrong paths that will kind of take us. And it's also kind of beyond the question of structural reorientation. So it's not a matter of where we invest. It's a lot more about how we actually govern our economic relations. How do we organize and govern our economic decisions? So I'm going to leave that here. I think I'm maybe a little bit late, but thank you for listening.
Yeah, it's on Zoom.
That's it.
Okay, I think we're ready for you, Damaris, if you want to share your screen.
Yeah, floor is yours, Damaris, but you are muted.
Well, I'm sorry about that. We've been doing this for quite a while and I still can't manage to unmute myself at the right moment. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here for a range of reasons, but particularly because as coordinating editor and editor-in-chief of SCED, Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, we do get submissions from many of you, and I've noticed that at least one of the other keynote speakers is recently published in SCED. So it's great to be here and talk about the journal, which is a pluralist journal. We publish a lot of heterodox economics. We also publish a lot of what we hope is smart, more mainstream economics, mainly information economics, but also some energy economics. And I'm pleased to say that SCED actually now is in the top 9% of economics journals. So it's one of the few pluralist journals that really has cracked the top decile, according to impact factors. So we hope that if you're considering publishing something that you want to reach a wide audience, that you'll consider SCED. We're happy to receive submissions from this community and look forward to engaging with you. My talk today is about Aftalion, who I think Roberto Scazzieri and I would say is the most important economist most of you haven't heard of. He's fairly obscure, and that's partly because his early work, which is really important theoretically, is written in a French style that is quite inaccessible. And I'll get to that in a moment. But I'm also talking about how his theory of structural transformation is relevant to an era of decarbonization. And although this talk is not specifically about ecological justice. It is about what's wrong with existing Nordhausian climate change economics and why that framework produces such unjust recommendations in climate policy, and how we think a much more structurally nuanced approach will yield different recommendations altogether. So to begin, just briefly on Aftalian's biography, and it's interesting actually because he's Bulgarian. There's quite an argument about how to pronounce his name because many Bulgarian economists don't like the French pronunciation, and the French think that the Bulgarian pronunciation is uncouth. So there you go. But anyhow, the work that we're mainly talking about today is his habilitation, which was published in 1913. He had a very fraught relationship with French academia, with very credible charges of anti-Semitism, resulting in his relative exclusion from the French Academy until after the war. He was a Bulgarian Jew who fled the pogroms in Odessa, and he grew up speaking Hebrew, Bulgarian, or Yiddish, Bulgarian, and German, then immigrated to Germany and finally to France. French, of course, was a language he learned in relative late adulthood. And as a consequence, his French was not particularly fluent, and his early French did not conform to the usual conventions. French is a very prescriptive language, whereas he tended to treat it more like German in terms of syntax and in terms of freedom of expression. So the early work is not particularly easy to read and is actually quite a challenge to translate. But his theoretical work is tremendously important to how we understand intersectorial interdependencies, but he's mainly remembered as the founder of the Revue Économique and also for the Aftalian-Clark accelerator principle, which is kind of the inverse of the Keynesian multiplier. Now, Roberto Scazzieri, Ivano Cardinale, and I undertook about 10 years ago to translate this work. Now, it's about 250,000 words, so it was always going to be a challenge to translate for the economic ideas that built Europe series with Anthem. But the linguistic problems are the more serious concern because also he's not particularly consistent about the way in which he phrases things. So he can use an expression on one occasion and then use a different expression for the same concept on another occasion. And it has made it really challenging to translate, but we're almost there. And it's part of a series of two works. Lescure's General and Periodic Crises of Overproduction was published in November of 2023. And that is a more historicist account of the role of intersectorial interdependencies in periodic crises and in general crises at the turn of the 20th century and even earlier. It goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. Aftalian's a less historicist, a more structural approach, and is the one that I'm talking about today. But if you're interested in this body of work, you might have a look at the Lescure volume. I think the main reason that you probably haven't heard of either of these authors is because everybody follows Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis, and Schumpeter in a footnote sort of dismissed them as being business cycle theorists in the mode of Vogler, and as a consequence of no particular interest. And unfortunately, a lot of other historians of economic thought who take Schumpeter as gospel have likewise ignored them. But we would argue that they're actually extremely important and neglected. Now, we were fortunate enough to have a forthcoming article in the Business History Review in the Forms of Capitalism special issue that actually is the article length version of what I'm covering in this talk. Unfortunately, Cambridge University Press has been hit by a cyber attack, which has delayed the production of this volume by 3 months and may delay it even further. So, and they don't have advanced views. So hopefully you'll be able to read this by the end of the summer, but I just wanted to let you know that it's out there. And I want to summarize it briefly since unfortunately it's not available online because of that cyber attack. Again, as part of this special issue on forms of capitalism organized by the Business History Initiative, Peter Hall's article on growth regimes is kind of the foundational article in this special issue. That is available online if you're interested in it. But most of the subsequent articles in the special issue haven't made it onto advanced view even because of the cyber attack. We argue in the introduction that the importance of sequential causality and interdependence, intersectorial interdependence and structural change can be thought of in terms of the transformation and the composition of macroeconomic aggregates. We introduce you to Aftalion. Then we also introduce a structural analysis at intermediate levels of aggregation, the transmission of intersectorial shocks, international transmission and the policy implications thereof. And we use the example of his monetary policy to unpack this. But we're, also considering the sense in which Schumpeter's contextualization with him in the structural business cycle tradition is worth spending time over. And then we talk about decarbonization as a new growth regime in the sense that Peter Hall offered, and look at the implications of Atalian's analysis for the way in which we do integrated assessment modeling. And then we end with the discussion of the political economies of structural transformations, both in the immediate context and over a longer historical period. Now, in terms of our arguments about structural transformation in an era of decarbonization, neoclassical climate change economics, as many of you know, models the interaction between the energy system, the macroeconomy, and the climate system, and it led, for better or worse, to Nordhaus winning the 2018 Nobel Memorial Prize. But unfortunately, it has significant limitations, which many heterodox economists, from Steve Keen to Jamie Galbraith and others, have commented upon at length. It tends to see only certain sectors of the economy as affected by climate change. It ignores the propagation of intersectorial shocks. It ignores induced innovation. And as a consequence, it underestimates climate damage. And as a consequence, Nordhaus's initial proposal was to limit global warming to 4 degrees centigrade, which we now recognize as disastrous. And as a consequence, the 2015 recommendations to limit it to 1.5 C have not been propagated within a framework in which it's possible to deliver on them. And we're almost certainly going to miss that target, and probably even miss the 2 and 2.5 C targets. So although integrated assessment modeling is extremely important analytically in terms of getting together the social science and the natural science in order to make recommendations for climate policy, the basic framework is flawed, and it's flawed because of the approach that Nordhaus took. Now, the regionally integrated climate economic models have improved significantly upon the dynamically integrated climate economic models that Nordhaus first developed, but they still omit any type of structural dynamics at a sectorial level. There's also a distinction in the integrated assessment modeling framework between damage models and process-based models. And the process-based models are used to formulate optimal decarbonization pathways. And it's even more urgent to consider intersectorial interdependencies in establishing these mitigation scenarios and establishing the optimal decarbonization pathways. So that's the argument that we make. And in terms of understanding the recent challenges and improvements to Nordhaus and where our own proposals fit in, it is important to acknowledge that the damage models were reworked in 2020 by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And their models are better grounded in climate science, and they use more realistic social discounting. And there's a whole lot of recent interest in this. I recently gave a keynote at the Cambridge Sustainability Leadership Forum. And what was interesting about that is that we heard from the editor-in-chief of Energy Economics, who has undertaken to illustrate that if you look geographically, and also if you look at different journal types from economics to business to geography to environmental science, you find very, very different social discount rates. And that is extremely important to understanding differences in how climate policy is formulated. But the point is that, the 2020 updates did improve things, but we argue haven't improved things enough. Michael Grubb, who's a colleague at UCL in 2023, has a working paper that's under review, which introduces dynamic aspects, but it focuses especially on induced innovation, frictions, and path dependencies. So it very much uses a new Keynesian framework. There are less tractable approaches which have been suggested by evolutionary economists using agent-based models. These are mainly used to critique market-based solutions like emissions trading, but they tend to ignore mutual interdependencies, indirect effects, and the feedbacks associated with industrial and climate policy. They're also very hard to operationalize in terms of climate policy frameworks, because they tend to be more critical than useful in constructing climate policy. Formal intersectorial modeling of climate risks is rare, and that's where we want to get. The best example is the intersectorial model impact comparison project, which looks at trade-offs in the primary sector. Of course, one of the reasons that it's done in the primary sector is that the near universal presence of agricultural subsidy regimes means that the data is available to do this. And we feel that resources like Dabo Guan, who's also a colleague at UCL and at Tsinghua, that his carbon emissions accounts database is very helpful in facilitating the kind of work we want to do. But clearly the availability of data has been a limitation to intersectoral modeling of climate impacts. Now, what I'm going to do today in terms of talking about the applications of potential application of our approach is essentially a proof of concept to illustrate to you why this is so important. And just as a first pass, this is a very simple approach to take involving model coupling and coupling as an approach to thinking about intersectoral interdependencies. And it's also using policy normative scenarios. So it's not by any means the most radical approach, but I think even using this approach, you could see what's at stake in terms of building in multi-sectoral modeling and modeling the interdependencies in the IAM framework. So this is a paper with colleagues at Xi'an Jiaotong University primarily, and also in the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And we're looking at a model coupling approach that involves a LEAP model and an IO model. Now, as we say, right, widespread recognition of the importance of energy transitions is there, but the current IAMs underestimate the indirect effects of changing the energy mix and the effects of the intersectoral interdependencies. They also tend to omit the spatial considerations, and we're trying to illustrate why it's so important to consider these. We propose model coupling of integrated assessment models and IO modeling to address some of the limitations of existing approaches. There have been other attempts to do this, but they're generally limited to a specific industry or to a specific urban setting. And we're looking at a multi-industry, multi-city perspective. So we use sectorial data from 20 sectors in China and consumption data from 16 cities, which cover most of the in the case of the sectorial data, the first 20 years of the 21st century, and in the case of the 16 cities, the pandemic years. At a national level, we look at or just before the pandemic and then the pandemic years. At a national level, we look at intersectoral energy consumption flows using a LEAP IO model, and then use scenario analysis to suggest sectorial level specific strategies and city specific strategies. And the interesting thing about the LEAP model is that it tracks energy consumption, production, and resource extraction across all sectors of the economy. It was developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, I think you'll find it is a very powerful modeling approach, and one that lends itself to model coupling, which is why we were so keen to use it to develop this example. It has had a recent upgrade in concert with the 2020 PIC updates, but the point is that it is quite a well accepted and well known and tractable model for coupling purposes. Now, in terms of the model structure, we are coupling both the input output modeling and also the spatial modeling in order to illustrate both approaches. There are 20 sectors, I said, in 16 cities. And in terms of energy transformation, it's actually coking, not cooking. That was an autocorrect that never got fixed. Heat, power generation, petroleum processing, and coal washing that produce energy supply, again, to the industrial sectors and to the cities. In terms of energy resources, we look at primary energy resources and also at secondary energy resources. Now, the data sources that we use and the scenario design is worth commenting upon. The carbon emissions accounts database is used for national level data. The sectorial output data is from China's IO tables, and the IEA energy conversion tables. Gross outputs for primary sector are from the State Statistics Bureau. The emissions factor data is taken from the TED database within the LEAP module itself. And again, all of this data is publicly available and is surprising. I mean, there are some inconsistencies and some interpolations necessary, but largely the data it's possible to analyze it together without too many caveats. The scenario design considers economic development, urbanization rates, and energy consumption. and emission control targets that have variously been propagated. And again, it is policy normative, because what we're trying to do is to illustrate the importance of the model coupling to the analysis and the effect that that then has in terms of climate policy. The relevant data and policies are sourced from publicly available documents. We established 3 scenarios: the baseline scenario, the energy transition scenario, which we provisionally labeled ETS, and then realized that referees are likely to confuse this with emission trading systems, so we'll probably change that acronym. And then energy transitions with CCS as a scenario, not because we're interested particularly in encouraging people to adopt CCS, but because that is relevant to illustrating the potential interactions amongst the sectors of the economy, and why targeting greener manufacturing is so important. But also because CCS is baked into the policy framework that China has promulgated for decarbonization of these sectors. Now, in terms of the energy output of energy sectors from 2022 through to 2021, you've got the various 2 to 3 year data points looking at mining, coal, petroleum, and nuclear fuels, electricity, and water. And I just put that out there so that you can get a general sense of the scale of this. Energy consumption output share of energy industry sectors, again, to illustrate what we're doing. And then of light industries versus heavy industries. And of course, in China, the geographical distribution of light versus heavy manufacturing is very different and is changing fairly rapidly. Also, urbanization rates play into this, particularly as larger cities urbanize faster than some of the smaller and medium-sized cities. Heavy industries, again, by category in China. And I also am conscious of the time because this talk can last an hour, it can last 20 minutes, and I want to make sure that we have time for the third speaker. In terms of the carbon emissions caused by energy resources input from the mining sector to heavy industry, I think this schematic is quite helpful in terms of understanding the way in which we formulate primary energy versus secondary energy, and the various points at which policies can impact or incentivize decarbonization. And again, the ratio of consumption there is helpful to think about. Now, in terms of the scenario development, the historical and scenario total energy demand in the baseline scenario, and again, we're going to 2030 because that's in line with China's own commitments to to decarbonization. The baseline scenario does assume in many of these a somewhat modest but steady increase. The historical and scenario total energy demand in terms of the energy transition scenario suggests that it plateaus quite dramatically in most sectors and begins to decline in some. And then the real fall off will come in terms of the energy transitions. And again, we adopted EES as an alternative to ETS here because of the concerns about it being confused with emissions trading. But the point is that it begins to drop off very steeply in the ETS CCS scenario. Now, the thing is that this is geographically very variegated, and that is also important to demonstrate. So it's one thing to do the intersectorial modeling, but it's also important to ensure that when you start to think about the variegated effects of climate policy, that you consider the spatial modeling. And again, the different scenarios produce, in some cases, fairly consistent, in some cases, really quite different results and across the 16 cities that we look at. Now, this has led us to suggest city-specific circumstances and targeted strategies for these cities. There's a high proportion of industrial output, and the targeted strategy is the industrial system transformation. Low degree of industrial electrification suggests that adding electrification equipment is the most likely single target strategy. the low installed capacity of new energy generation in these areas suggests that increasing the installed capacity of greener energy is the most successful or most likely to be successful strategy. Now, this is a very preliminary. Okay, I'm just gonna wrap this up now. Sorry, I'm trying to keep it to time. Conclusions from our study, as expected, accounting for intersectoral interdependencies demonstrates the current energy mix and industrial structures experience greater difficulty than expected in meeting the targets as established. So the targets, if you take into account the intersectoral interdependencies, are not realistic as established. Carbon emissions associated with development are generally underestimated, but energy transmissions with CCS can contribute greater gains than expected. This doesn't always mean more CCS. Quite the contrary. What it does mean is that greener manufacturing should be a very significant target of climate policy. There is a limitation with respect to using historical industrial structure to predict future industrial structure, but we're only going to 2030. It's a function of timescales. If we were taking this out to 2050, that would be a more serious consideration. But in terms of the modeling approach, it is something that needs much greater thought. Also, we use major cities, and that implies assumptions that may not hold for smaller and medium-sized cities. But I'm aware that I'm out of time, so I think I'll wrap it up now. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you can see that this is a potentially a significant improvement over the current IAM framework. Thank you. Okay. I hope that has, I realize that I probably still ran over, but I hope that that has picked up a little bit of time.
Make sure to share the slides on Zoom. Yes, otherwise we didn't see.
Like, 5 minutes.
Good. Many thanks, Roberto, for the introduction earlier. Many thanks to the organizers for the invitation. It's great to be in this panel. So yes, what I would like to do is to follow up on some of the issues already mentioned by Bengi and Dimaris, and I would also like to focus on macroeconomic policies and the role of climate. So a few years ago, the climate agenda was not very popular in mainstream economic policy institutions such as World Bank and the IMF. However, this has changed over the last 8 years. So we have seen some of these mainstream economic policy institutions suggesting their own green climate agenda, and they have their own green solutions. And obviously, their green solutions do not want to change the existing status quo. These green solutions actually rely a lot on these market-based mechanisms. And have as an aim, or some of them at least, to increase the power of finance, and they don't have as an aim to change to deal with environmental justice issues. So the green macrofinancial policies that I mentioned are part of these green solutions, and the mainstream economic policy institutions suggest specific green solutions like carbon prices, green subsidies. I'm going to mention in a bit that the US has used green subsidies. There is also climate stress testing where it can be used in order to understand the exposure of the financial system to climate change. And obviously, they are in favor of de-risking climate projects. So this is in line with what Daniela Gabo says about the Wall Street consensus. So as I was saying, in my talk, I would like to evaluate some of these green macrofinancial policies, and I'll do that from an heterodox perspective and an environmental justice lens. Moreover, I would like to talk a little bit about some heterodox alternatives that have been suggested. And when I use the term heterodox, I need to clarify that from the beginning. I will focus mainly on the post-Keynesian framework and the critical macrofinance framework. So
Mainstream economists consider that climate change is an externality. So according to them is a market failure because we don't have a price on nature. This is in line with what Bengi mentioned in her talk. So mainstream economists think that we need to put the correct price on nature in order to internalize these externalities. And as a result, according to the mainstream literature, we can solve the problem. And obviously, this is behind the DICE model that Damaris mentioned before. So when we talk about carbon pricing, we need to understand carbon pricing in this theoretical framework. So various mainstream economic institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have pushed various countries in order to use carbon pricing, and these can take the form of carbon taxes or cap and trade, where firms have permits in order to produce emissions. If they don't have, if they want to produce more emissions, they have to buy more permits from the market. Or the figure, hopefully, you can see that carbon taxes, carbon prices have been implemented in a large number of countries around the world. For example, recently, Argentina and South Africa have used carbon taxes. In the figure, hopefully you can also see that the countries that have that are thinking to incorporate carbon pricing in the future. Now, despite the fact that carbon pricing fits very, very well in this mainstream narrative, obviously mainstream economists have realized that there are issues. So they have identified some. I have two of them on the slide. The first one is that carbon prices can lead to inequality. So when we have a carbon prices, we can find that there is an increase in energy prices. Usually fossil fuel companies pay these carbon prices and they pass part of their cost on to their own prices. And as a result, poor people might not have enough income to pay their energy bills. Obviously, there is a solution according to this mainstream narrative, and they suggest revenue recycling to use at the same time, let's say, social benefits, or to reduce taxes for the poor. So this is their suggested solution. Mainstream economists have also recognized that it is enough to have carbon pricing in order to achieve the decarbonization of the economy. Again, they have a suggested solution. One of them is to use alternative policies, other policies like green subsidies. So, for example, I've had recently Biden introducing green subsidies in the US. He did that with introducing this Inflation Reduction Act. You can see in the figure the effects of these tax credit, which actually reduce the cost of renewable energy projects like solar and wind. Mainstream economists also suggest other type of policies to be used at the same time with carbon pricing, and they rely a lot on this de-risking process that I mentioned before. So the idea is to mobilize private finance in order to fund energy projects, especially in the global south, since governments have difficulty funding their own green projects. So these are some of the problems that the mainstream have realized, but obviously there are heterodox critics to this mainstream narrative that I mentioned before, where carbon pricing plays a key role. The first one is that, yes, obviously carbon pricing can affect inequality, but we cannot solve this by using only these social transfers that I mentioned before. We need also to take into account that carbon pricing can lead to gender inequality, and especially this is the case for specific, let's say, energy taxes that can affect the income of women because they use energy in their everyday life. There is also another critique that focuses on green subsidies, especially if they are used on their own. And this is linked to what we call macroeconomic rebound effects, and it's linked with the growth literature. When we have done some work on this with Yanis Dafermos and Yorgos Galanis, we have developed a global ecological macroeconomic model. And actually we find that when these green subsidies are introduced, then we have that firms have more profits and more economic activity in the end. So more economic activity, but at the same time, we have an improvement in green energy, in green investment, and as a result of this, we have an improvement in the recycling rates, in material efficiency, also in emission intensity. So we find that initially, when we introduce these green subsidies, we have a reduction in emissions, we have a reduction in waste, but as time passes, economic activity increases more, and then we find an increase in emissions or in waste. So in the figure, you can see that at the end of the simulations, we have an increase in waste, and it becomes higher than what we call the baseline scenario, where we don't introduce any type of policies. So that's the second critique from the heterodox perspective. And the third one is that when we talk about specific green fiscal policies, they might create more demand for specific green minerals like copper and lithium. And obviously this is problematic because we might have governments pushing to lower the cost in order to produce these green minerals or extract them. And in some cases, this takes place with negative effects on the environment. So for example, in the case of copper, we need a lot of water in order to extract it. When this criticism says that when we focus in specific green fiscal policies, we might lead to what we call green extractivism. And obviously, we need to take this into account. So these were some of the critiques, heterodox critiques from for the mainstream narrative. There is another one that is not discussed so much in the literature. So I think implicitly the mainstream narrative assumes that when we have these green fiscal policies, probably it will affect equally the global north and the global south. So if there is an increase in green spending, we might have an equal improvement, let's say in terms of gross value added in the global north, and an improvement, a similar improvement in terms of gross value added in the global south. However, I don't think that this might be the case. We might have an increase in green spending that might be more beneficial to the global north countries and less beneficial to the global south. We have started working on this with Jasmine Lucas and Özlem Onaran. We use an input-output analysis, and we use exo-based data. So what we have started doing is to have different sectors. You can see the green energy sector, the fossil, and the rest of the sectors. And then we have different groups, different country groups. And we wanted to understand if we have an increase in green energy, how gross output will be affected. So we found that if we have an increase in €1 of green energy spending, this will increase gross output by 1.7. However, the same increase in this €1 of green energy spending will increase on average 1.3 in terms of gross output global south countries like specific Latin America and African countries. And we think that this is because of the subordination of global south countries, which obviously, and of course, this is related to this to global value chains. So this is something that we need to take into account, because if we have more these green fiscal policies, we might have a worsening of global inequality. Next one. So yeah, that were some of the heterodox critiques, but I would like also to mention some of the heterodox alternatives. Let me repeat that these heterodox alternatives refer to the post-Keynesian framework and the critical macrofinance framework. So I said before that when we have this mainstream narrative, we have carbon prices at the core. This is not the case in the heterodox framework. Instead, we have that the state is at the core of the decarbonization of the economy, and the governments could rely a lot on green public investment. And obviously, in order to do that, it would help to nationalize specific parts of the economy, like energy and transport. Obviously, this is difficult nowadays because over the last years, there have been a lot of privatization. So it would be good to get back some of these, the state would get back some of these sectors. These heterodox alternatives also suggest that specific types of green public investment can also be conducive to gender inequality. So, for example, we could have social care infrastructure in order to improve a bit gender equality. I have done some work with the Women's Budget Group and explained a little bit the links between green public investment, gender inequality. Then we can also have specific types of green public investment that could change our consumption patterns. So, for example, we could have in large cities low carbon transport. So poor people could instead use the public transport, probably could be free, instead of using their own petrol car. So what I'm saying is that there are specific types of green public investment that also can allow us to change our consumption patterns in line with the growth literature. And obviously this is in line with what should happen in the global north. Overall, we should change consumption norms, especially in the global north, and green public investment can support that. Another suggestion within this heterodox alternative is to discipline what we call private capital, which obviously is linked with the risk process before. And the idea is to have both sticks and carrots. So you could have an environmental regulation policy that actually restricts dirty capital, but at the same time use some form of subsidies like green subsidies in order to support green energy projects. So there are some links between green fiscal policies and environmental justice. So what I have on the slide is something that we could take into account when we have these green fiscal policies. So for example, we could have low carbon public infrastructure that makes sure that does not rely, 5 minutes, thank you. So I have to be a little bit quick.
I don't know how much is left.
Half. So so I'll briefly explain that in order to talk about green monetary policies as well. So what I was saying is that there are specific types of let's say conditionalities. So we shouldn't invest in low carbon infrastructure that relies on lithium extraction, and especially the one that exploits workers in the global south. When we evaluate specific companies, and this is the case when the government provides some specific financial support, we shouldn't use carbon offsets. So usually some companies might use these carbon offsets in order to improve their environmental performance. So we need to make sure to avoid having carbon offsets to the evaluation, because this restricts a little bit the carbon rights of indigenous people. And there are specific projects like wind farms, solar panels that shouldn't rely on land grabbing. So that was it for the green fiscal policies. Now let me turn to green financial and monetary policy. Again, I'll start with the mainstream narrative and then explain a little bit the heterodox alternatives. So you might not be surprised, but central banks and financial institutions are interested a lot about climate change, basically because climate change can create financial risks and potentially a kind of a crisis. So central banks wanted to avoid these climate risks. So they have a number of tools in order to make sure to protect the financial system. So for example, they have climate stress tests the Bank of England and the ECB have introduced this climate stress test over the last years in order to understand the exposure of the financial system to climate change. There was a lot of demand for credit rating agencies to take into account climate physical risks and actually update the credit profile of the governments. And recently, there has been some green QE programs, quantitative easing programs, and I'm going to mention that in a bit. Some of these QE programs in the Bank of England and in the ECB, they have bought some bonds that have better climate performance, but obviously they do that because they want to protect their own balance sheet. Global North governments obviously know, but at least now they have accepted that Global South countries are not so much able as Global North governments to finance some of their green projects. So as a result of this, Global North countries have promised to provide $100 billion per year, and this started in 2009 in order to support countries in the Global South. Recently, we had this loss and damage fund, again, to support more climate vulnerable countries, usually in the Global South. But what I will explain this in some of this in a bit, but the basic idea of these green financial and monetary policies is that they want to rely on private finance. So there is a gap, a green finance gap, and they want to make sure that the private finance will fill this gap. So that was the mainstream narrative of these monetary and financial policies, but obviously there are some heterodox critics to this narrative. We have this notion of double materiality. Heterodox economists have used this idea of double materiality that actually talks about causations, and this idea of double materiality says that climate change can affect the financial system, which actually is the causality in favor of this mainstream narrative that I mentioned before. But heterodox economists also say that the financial system can also affect the climate change. So in the figure, you can see the amount of financing that has been provided over the last years between 2016 and 2023 by large banks around the world. In the figure, you can see JP Morgan Chase on its own for this period they have provided close to $500 billion USD in order to finance fossil fuel projects, which obviously is too much. So what we need to do is to protect the climate system from the dirty finance. This is what heterodox economists suggest. Okay, 1 minute. Can I negotiate?
Ask the audience. Plenty of time.
No. Okay. Yeah. So yes. So the mainstream economists say that we need to protect the financial system from climate change. Heterodox economists actually say the other way around. We need to protect climate change from finance, and particularly dirty finance. In my 1 minute, I will explain probably briefly some of the slides, and I will have half a minute in order to summarize. Just 1 point about these green QE programs that I mentioned before. The Bank of England has introduced this green QE recently, and we have done some work on this with Jens Dafemos, Daniela Gabon, and Frank van Lerven. And actually what we have seen is that the Bank of England QE program relies a lot on what we call a market neutrality. So they have bought some bonds that are more environmentally friendly, but they do that within restrictions. We need to move beyond this market neutrality, and on top of it, we need to exclude bonds that are issued by fossil fuel companies. So central banks could be more active. This slide very briefly refers to this climate finance for the global south. And just to give you some numbers, I mentioned before that the global north was committed to provide 100 billion per year. They haven't met over the last year this target. Only 2022 they were able to provide more than 100 billion to the global south. On top of it, you can see that the majority of them are for adaptation funding, which is not enough, especially for countries in the global south. And the majority of them are in the form of loans, meaning the governments at some point have to pay back this. Credit rating agencies, what I would just like to say to emphasize is that they play a significant role to the financing of the global south countries, and they can contribute to this public debt climate vicious cycle because there have been a lot of work on this. Standard & Poor's, for example, has this figure that I have on the slide. And if you look at it, if you want, we can discuss during the Q&A. The idea is that you might expect over the next years credit rating agencies to downgrade governments in the global south, and obviously this will increase the debts. Alternative policies, just to give you an overview, and I'll finish in a couple of seconds. Just to briefly mention that we could have a direct decarbonization of finance. We can introduce a kind of a green credit guidance. And it's very interesting that global north countries have not done something like that, introducing green credit guidance, but there are some central banks in the global south that have introduced a green credit guidance. We can rely on public banks, obviously reparations can play an important role, but just want to summarize with this. I just want to clarify that I mentioned some policies relying on this post-Keynesian critical macro finance perspective, but these policies will not be enough to deal with climate change and at the same time deal with environmental justice. There might be some change in power relationships away from finance, and we might have in some cases some more power in workers or in groups in the global south. And as a result of this, we might have some gradual changes in our economy a bit later. But in any case, even these heterodox policies that I mentioned might not be easy to implement it because they are against the big finance and big industrial capital. So that's it from my side. Thanks.
Okay, time for questions. We started late, so we're going to go a little bit over. I would like, however, to ask everyone to ask questions and for us to give presentations of their own, so as to give enough time for everyone to chip in. So if you want to ask a question and you're welcome to do so, just raise your hand. Then you can disrupt. Yeah, wonderful. Few questions?
Thank you. Great presentations. This is primarily for Dr. Akbulut. But for anyone, have you considered, or has this been part of your thinking and you just maybe didn't talk about it, various like indigenous ways of knowing and doing in the way you thought about what you talked about today? Thanks.
Any praise the speaker? Perfect question.
There's one behind me. Should I go ahead or I don't know?
Oh, let's take a few. Follow. Ingrid, you have.
No, sorry.
So it's from the School for Social Research. I really liked, and I'm still kind of reeling about it. Like many people have thought about what economics has done to contribute to the current problem, and the presentation session, everything that I so far thought was important on that realm. It's been a long time since economics has thought about production, what it is that we actually produce as an output. In wartime, capitalist qualities appear to be able to do it. Outside of wartime, less so. Individualism looms large as well. It's a civilization of that. Economics has helped people imagine a world where their impact on it and its impact on themselves disappears, and that doesn't help. That takes me to the question that I have for the three speakers, which is more in the realm of politics, which is where I always stop short. What are the political obstacles to the various measures that we envision, whether we're talking about the institutional variants and innovations that the first presentation was talking about, the macro level policies of the final presentation, or the detailed IO type interventions that middle presentation, the Morris presentation was talking about. Because I quite honestly despair whenever I think about how do we pursue in a joined up way any of those three interesting courses of action because of the political obstacles. How do we get around that?
Well, let's get another one and then.
Question itself is another.
There you go.
It's all right, all right.
No, because otherwise. we won't
Okay.
hit.
Right, just a few random thoughts. So first of all, it's just a question about whether there is a human essence. It seems to me, yes, there is a human essence and it's to produce. But under capitalism, that becomes production for production's sake, i.e. producing corporations produce for profit. And it seems to me that there's no way of stopping them producing for profit. And that therefore defines the limits of their ability to respond to the climate crisis, which I think is very much related to the trade crisis and the Chinese American trade war. Now, if you take China's investment, recently invested in EVs, solar, blah, blah, blah. It's not because of anything to do with policy intention, it's to do with the collapse of their residential housing sector and the need to keep their steel furnaces busy. But that therefore seems to me to be very important because with the collapse with their massive investment in EV and climate measures, that is seen very much as a threat by the US and Europe has put tariffs on, haven't they? So it seems to me that that is where there is this overlap between politics and economics and the climate crisis that is very much related to trade wars, which seems to be an insurmountable problem. I wondered if you have any thoughts on that now.
Let's do these three first and then get back to you, okay?
Yeah, okay.
Obviously, yeah, I mean, that like indigenous thinking and indigenous ways of seeing the world, I think is something as heterodox economists we should be more explicit about. I had not thought about it. I am very much inspired by it, but the kind of framework within which I was trying to speak to this audience, there was the thing about our role and our responsibility as heterodox economists. So this is not to say that, I mean, a lot of, I think, what kind of this idea of like nested kind of systems, co-evolution has a lot kind of critique of modern Western science and Newtonian thinking that I think has a lot more in indigenous kind of cosmologies and their critique of modern science and its implicatedness in colonialism. So obviously it is, but it wasn't kind of, it wasn't my pitch, but thank you for bringing that more kind of explicitly into the book. I mean, kind of this idea of thank you for, I mean, by the way, thank you for all the questions, they're very inspiring. The role that economics has and kind of its impact in the world, I think is something that we also kind of have to think about a lot more explicitly, and like we should teach our students to think about and why it matters, like why the kind of these economics that we make matters. And it's not only like one thing that like kind of saying that, oh, these ideas about individual behavior are unrealistic, or like how markets are unrealistic, that's okay. But I mean, like, it's not that they're only unrealistic, like this idea that individuals only respond to price incentives. Informs a lot of policy that actually then make individuals who are only responsible to price incentives. So these frameworks that we produce are not only in the papers or in the classrooms, they inform. And like one way that Nordhaus has kind of also impacted the conversation about climate policy is that he has, since early 1990s, systematically advised that climate action should be delayed. Because his assumption about growth is that with increased growth, we'll be able to find more advanced technologies to clean up our quote unquote shit, that's a technical term. But like everything that like Heterodox economics says about this is that there is no kind of one, like we cannot, like there is no reversibility of like the impacts that we have. So, but like Nordhaus made a lot of people believe that we can. And I single-handedly hold them responsible for delaying climate action in certain timeframes. But I mean, in terms of kind of the obstacles, yeah, I mean, I think we also create obstacles in a way for ourselves, but of course, like the main obstacle is capitalism. I think like this is kind of the elephant in the room. Like we live in like we are in part of an political and economic system that kind of is built on production for production. It's built on exploitation of workers of different kinds of social and ecological reproduction as well as production. But I'm not as hopeless. It might not be, I mean, I kind of want to draw on something that Maria talked about. There are certain things we can do that will enlarge our capacity to do more in the future. Fiscal policy could be one part of it, but one thing that we should definitely do as economists is to learn more from existing struggles and what kind of things they need and what kind of knowledge they need. And I think there's already struggles winning some, losing a lot, but winning some, and they already have visions about how to overcome these obstacles. And we should be a lot more learning and hearing from them. And I think we should be a lot more engaged with social movements, struggles, rather than only kind of policy struggles, but actual kind of struggles on the ground. I think that there's a lot to learn from history, and I don't mean kind of very long kind of past history, but in 1990s in Latin America, post-extractivism, there's a lot of like both policy level, institutional level, kind of struggle level. There is a lot to learn, and I think we should be kind of, I mean, it's kind of the Gramscian term, right? Optimism of the will. So, but yes, I mean, there is going to be obstacles. That's for sure.
Damaris, your turn.
Yeah. Okay,
You're
thank you.
muted.
Oh, I think you can hear me now, can't you?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think in terms of the first question on indigenous knowledge, I would say two things. One is that I think where indigenous knowledge is probably most useful is understanding these differences geographically about the social costs of carbon, and their indigenous populations are even more susceptible to climate change than other groups. And I think it's very important to include their voices in our understanding of this. Also, I think in terms of understanding any kind of intersectoral modeling in the primary sector in terms of trade-offs about land use, it's very much relevant to include indigenous knowledge. But what I'm really looking at in terms of strategies for greening manufacturing that take into account intersectoral interdependencies in the secondary sector, I'm not sure that there's as much a place for thinking about indigenous knowledge, but it's a very interesting question and has been thought-provoking for me. I think it's interesting in terms of politically, how desperate is this and how much of an opportunity is there to advance a more aggressive climate policy agenda. I think that things have changed quite a lot in the last few years. And I think even in spaces that have previously been unhelpful, like multilateral development banks that have been rebadging themselves as climate banks, some to a greater or lesser degree than others are actually taking it seriously. Others perhaps are less aggressive as we'd like them to be. But I think in terms of Europe, the question about state aid and sectorial support and framework for competition policy, there has been a rowing back from that and a much greater space carved out for industrial policy precisely because of the climate crisis. And I think that will only continue. And I think that one thing that in trying to argue in terms of the leverage that intersectoral modeling gives you not only analytically on the problem, but also the importance of these intersectoral interdependencies and the transmission of these shocks is that actually industrial policy is where the action is. Greening manufacturing is where the action is. Yes, changing the behavior of households is important, but actually you get more leverage if you attack this by greening the manufacturing sector. And I think that that is something that is being heard. Now, of course, there is at the moment a lot of pushback, and I think that the North American space where the Trump administration and Project 2025 intends to take it in an entirely different direction is really quite scary and unfortunate. But I think in other spaces, you do see industrial strategy being taken seriously again, precisely because of the need to green manufacturing. In terms of this other question about Marxist economics and the cost price problem that Brian had framed, and then the question about how to stop production based on profit, I would say that the biggest issue here is how to take seriously natural capital within our frameworks. And I think that is something that many heterodox economists and ecological economists are looking at seriously, and is something that I would entirely support. But it's not something in which I have immediate expertise. But I think that ultimately natural capital is something that needs to be firmly integrated into our modeling efforts. And I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick because I understand that most people might want to go to the other session. So 2 points. The first one. Thanks. The first one is on indigenous people. So many thanks for raising this question. It was not part actually of my talk, but probably the points of green extractivism might be linked with the indigenous people overall. So I think there are no specific policies that are mentioned, green fiscal policies, in particular, green public investment might lead to the demand of these green minerals. There are many global countries that have some of these green minerals, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, I think. So we need to understand their needs, at the same time try to meet their demands. But we also need to understand the natural constraints of, for example, extracting these green minerals. So if this means that we destroy the environment in global countries, in indigenous communities, this is something that we do need to change. So probably we need to think on how we can change a little bit the production process that we use, not enforce enough. Try to see if there are better ways to deal with us. And I mentioned that at least the global north countries would have some conditionalities. So they shouldn't have green projects that rely on these green standards. I'm not saying that that's the solution, but at least that's a way of starting thinking about it. And the other thing that I'd like to mention is about these policies and what is needed for me to do in order to implement some of the policies. I have found not interesting and what I would expected that many many financial institutions, many central banks were in favor of implementing green policies, supporting the green sector, because for them it is more profitable to do that. This is something that obviously you expect, but obviously they were against of penalizing any of these dirty sectors. So obviously something that is not profitable for them, it's not good. Financial institutions are not willing to make these changes. And as I said towards the end, any of these points that I mentioned will not go ahead because of the political constraints. So if we don't have a change in the power, we'll not be able to implement any of these things. So at some point I mentioned that we could have these large states where you have nationalization. This is one way we change probably the power relationships, and gradually we might be able to get something like that. That would be nice.
Thanks. So that's time for one very last. You want to ask a question very quickly and very quick.
A little bit fundamental question. I don't know
Well,
It has to be fast, but fundamental.
I mean, this last discussion was much more concrete than the different presentations that were a little bit vague, I think. But I would like to say that I don't think we have so much say in all of that. I mean, the major powers that are working now, working towards a green transition in as much as it is capitalistically profitable. And part of the financial sector is pushing for that, especially with all the de-risking of government that's going on. So I think that what we have to be aware of is what is going on, namely that governments and the capital are ganging up together right now in order to make some of these investments possible. But then we also have other consequences that will not really lead to this greening of the economy and the CO2 reduction because of the other consequences that a lot of the projects have. That also are very energy intensive. So I think that a lot more should be done on the economic side of what we can expect from some of these changes. And there I missed something in the research world, also from economists. Instead of talking about all the things that ought to be done, etc., what is happening? And of course, it is contradiction because on both sides the green and Western economy, and we have also the reactionary, still black economies going on. But I think it's important to sort these things out a little bit better. Thank you.
Okay, big. I think in a sense that's a comment. So I don't know whether Damaris, have you got anything to add? There are two speakers are giving up their right to reply. You're muted.
I struggled to hear it particularly well, unfortunately. So unless someone could summarize it for me, I think I'll also pass on that because I just can't really do justice to it without having heard more of it.
Okay, let's say you agree with the speaker. That's okay. That's perfectly okay. I think it was a sensible comment.
Okay, I just couldn't hear it.
Yeah. Fine. With that, I think we thank our speakers.
Thank you.
In the foyer. Thanks again. Thanks, Damaris.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Everyone, so we're gonna break for the coffee break. Damaris, thank you so much. Just to thank you before you leave.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Take care. All the best. Bye bye.
The breaks are changing. I'm presenting on the wise. I make sure participants can share that in my business. If you're with me, Also, like, but no matter now, and speaking to the Romanians, that all of that, and it's just too long. Was not as it is. You know, I wanted to shift. I think it's just. Yeah, so I think like, not with that, it will not be. Yeah. I mean, I'll be here and. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's, yeah, yeah, so. Particular. I think that's it here. I mean, and it goes. Yeah. Yeah. And I have to do a. Interesting, because like most of the trains to
The microphone is on.
I know, that's why I'm not.
Like,